August 1914. The Great War erupts in Europe. The British Empire, confident in its overwhelming power, expects a swift victory, even in the far-flung colonies of Africa. Their target, German East Africa. Their plan, a quick amphibious assault to capture the main port, Tanga. The local German commander was ordered not to resist. The British expected a polite surrender, perhaps a few ceremonial shots fired. What they got instead was a 4-day nightmare of chaos, incompetence, and bees. Thousands upon thousands of angry, aggressive African bees. This is the bizarre and humiliating true story of the Battle of Tanga, also known as the Battle of the Bees. If you're ready for a tale of imperial arrogance, brilliant guerrilla tactics, and nature itself intervening in warfare, hit that like button and subscribe for more strange tales from military history. What's the weirdest thing you've ever heard happening in a battle? Let us know in the comments below. Now, to the tropical shores of German East Africa. August 1914. The world was on fire. The intricate network of alliances and imperial ambitions that had defined the late 19th century finally snapped, plunging Europe into a conflict of unprecedented scale and brutality. The Great War. In London, the nerve center of the largest empire the world had ever known, the mood was one of grim determination mixed with a confident, almost casual expectation of a swift victory. While the main drama would unfold on the Western Front, the conflict was truly global, extending to the vast colonial possessions held by the European powers across Africa and Asia. For the British War Office, dealing with Germany's scattered colonies seemed like a straightforward mopping-up operation, a sideshow to the main event in Flanders. German East Africa, a vast territory encompassing modern-day Tanzania, Burundi, and Rwanda, was seen as a particularly ripe plum, ready for the plucking. Strategically, German East Africa posed a minimal threat. It was isolated, surrounded by British, Belgian, and Portuguese colonies, and its small military force, the Schutztruppe, was primarily designed for internal policing, not conventional warfare against a European power. The colony's real value lay in its potential to disrupt British shipping in the Indian Ocean, with its main port, Dar es Salaam, and the secondary port of Tanga offering potential bases for German commerce raiders. The British plan, therefore, was simple and seemingly foolproof. Seize the ports quickly, neutralize the colony's wireless station, and the campaign would be over before Christmas. The task was assigned to Indian Expeditionary Force B, or Force B, a contingent drawn largely from the British Indian Army, assembled hastily in India, and dispatched across the ocean. Command was given to Major General Arthur Aitken, an officer whose primary qualifications seemed to be seniority rather than any particular experience or aptitude for complex amphibious operations or colonial warfare. Force B was, on paper, an overwhelming force compared to the defenders. It numbered over 8,000 combat troops, primarily composed of regiments from the Indian Army, including battalions of Punjabis, Rajputs, and Kashmir Rifles, alongside one regular British battalion, the 2nd Battalion, Loyal North Lancashire Regiment. They were supported by artillery and engineers. However, this impressive number hid a multitude of critical weaknesses. Many of the Indian units were composed of poorly trained reservists or raw recruits, swept up in the mobilization drive. Their equipment was often second-rate, their leadership inexperienced, and crucially, they had received virtually no training in amphibious landings or bush warfare. They were packed onto transports in Bombay with little regard for tactical loading, meaning equipment needed first upon landing was often buried deep in the holds. Worse still was the prevailing attitude among the British command, a deeply ingrained imperial arrogance that held both the German colonial troops and their African soldiers, the Askari, in utter contempt. They expected a quick, easy victory against what they perceived as a disorganized rabble. This catastrophic underestimation would be the root cause of the disaster to come. Opposing them was perhaps the most remarkable and unconventional commander of the entire First World War, Lieutenant Colonel Paul von Lettow-Vorbeck. A Prussian aristocrat and a veteran of the Herero Wars in German Southwest Africa and the Boxer Rebellion in China, Lettow-Vorbeck was intelligent, ruthless, and possessed an iron will. Unlike his superiors in Berlin, who initially favored a passive defense of the colony, Lettow-Vorbeck saw the war in Africa not as a sideshow, but as a vital opportunity to tie down disproportionate Allied resources. His strategy was simple: avoid decisive battles, wage a relentless guerrilla campaign, and force the British Empire to expend vast amounts of men, money, and material hunting him across the vast wilderness. His instrument for this strategy was the Schutztruppe. On paper, it was a tiny force, just over 200 German officers and NCOs, and around 2,500 African soldiers, the Askari. But these Askari were not untrained levies. They were long-service professionals, rigorously trained, fiercely loyal to their German officers, often more so than to distant tribal chiefs, and masters of bushcraft and marksmanship. They were equipped with the excellent Mauser Model 1898 rifle, the same weapon used by the German army in Europe and supported by a handful of machine guns. Lettow-Vorbeck understood their strengths and trusted them implicitly, a stark contrast to the often racist attitudes prevalent in other colonial armies. When war broke out, Lettow-Vorbeck immediately disregarded the cautious instructions from Berlin and the colony's governor, Heinrich Schnee, who favored neutrality to protect the colony. He began mobilizing his forces and preparing for offensive action. His initial problem was that his tiny army was scattered across a vast territory. When news arrived that a major British landing force was headed for Tanga, Lettow-Vorbeck had only a single company of Askari, perhaps 200 men, garrisoning the port town. Tanga itself was the colony's second port, a sleepy administrative center surrounded by dense sisal plantations, mangrove swamps, and thick coastal bush. It was not a fortress. Its defenses consisted of little more than the local police station. The British plan involved a two-pronged attack. Force B, under Aitken, would conduct the main amphibious assault at Tanga. Simultaneously, Force C, another Indian Army contingent, would launch an overland invasion from British East Africa, modern Kenya, near Mount Kilimanjaro, aiming to cut the vital Usambara Railway that connected Tanga to the interior. The idea was to quickly overwhelm the colony from two directions. On November 2, 1914, the imposing sight of a British naval squadron appeared off the coast of Tanga. 14 transport ships, escorted by the battleship HMS Goliath and the cruiser HMS Fox, dropped anchor just outside the harbor. The sheer size of the fleet must have been terrifying to the handful of German defenders. What followed was a bizarre episode that perfectly encapsulated the confused, almost gentlemanly, start to the war in Africa. Captain F.W. Caulfield of HMS Fox was sent ashore under a flag of truce to deliver an ultimatum to the German district commissioner. The ultimatum demanded the immediate surrender of the town. Crucially, however, Caulfield also gave his word that he would respect a local agreement that Tanga would remain an open town, provided it was not used for military purposes. This agreement, made earlier between the British and German governors, was already null and void due to the state of war, but Caulfield's contradictory message sowed confusion. Even more bizarrely, Caulfield agreed to give the Germans until the following morning to reply and promised not to land troops until then, effectively throwing away the element of surprise. He even politely inquired about the location of any sea mines, which the Germans naturally declined to reveal. This farcical interlude gave Lettow-Vorbeck the one thing he desperately needed: time. As soon as he received word of the British fleet's arrival, he began rushing every available man towards Tanga via the Usambara Railway. Throughout the night of November 2nd and into the 3rd, Train after train arrived, disgorging companies of Askari and their German officers. By the time the British finally began their landings on November 3rd, lettow-vorbeck had managed to concentrate nearly 1,000 men in and around Tanga, still outnumbered 8-1, but now a credible fighting force under his direct dynamic command. General Aitken, aboard the transport ship Karmala, seemed paralyzed by indecision. His intelligence reports were wildly inaccurate, suggesting Tanga was undefended. He disregarded warnings from local British settlers about the fighting quality of the Askari. His plan for the landing was vague and poorly communicated. Instead of a swift, concentrated assault on the harbor itself, he opted for a landing on a difficult beach several miles south of the town, near Ras Kazone. This beach was fronted by mangrove swamps and thick jungle, terrible terrain for deploying troops. The initial landing in the early hours of November 3rd was chaotic. The tide was out, forcing the troops to wade through hundreds of yards of thick mud under sporadic rifle fire from German pickets. Coordination broke down. Units got lost in the dense bush. The advance towards Tanga was painfully slow, hampered by the terrain, the heat, and the unnerving, unseen enemy who sniped at them from the jungle. Lettow-vorbeck used this time brilliantly. He deployed his small force in a series of concealed positions along the likely routes of advance, turning the plantations and town outskirts into a deadly maze. His Askari, masters of camouflage and infiltration, melted into the landscape. They waited patiently, holding their fire until the British Indian troops were almost upon them, then unleashing devastating volleys at point-blank range before disappearing back into the bush. The psychological effect on the poorly trained Indian soldiers was immense. They were fighting an invisible enemy, taking casualties from unseen directions, their officers struggling to maintain control in the confusing terrain. Adding to the chaos was the abysmal performance of British leadership. General Aitken remained offshore aboard his transport for most of the battle, receiving conflicting reports and issuing vague orders. Communication between the landing force and the naval support ships was poor. Requests for naval gunfire support were often delayed or misdirected, sometimes resulting in shells falling dangerously close to friendly troops. By the evening of November 3rd, the British had managed to establish a precarious beachhead, but had made little progress towards Tanga itself. They had suffered significant casualties and morale was plummeting. The easy victory they had expected had evaporated in the face of determined resistance and their own incompetence. Lettow-vorbeck, sensing the enemy's disarray, prepared his forces for the main battle he knew was coming the next day. He had bluffed the British into believing he had a much larger force, and now, reinforced and holding strong defensive positions, he was ready to deliver the knockout blow. The stage was set for the Battle of Tanga proper, a fight that would descend into a bizarre and humiliating fiasco for the British Empire, complete with charging rhinos and swarms of angry bees. November 4th, 1914, Tanga, German East Africa. As dawn broke over the humid tropical coastline, the situation for Major General Aitken and Indian Expeditionary Force B was already precarious. The previous day's landings at Ras Kazone had been a chaotic mess, bogged down by mud, mangrove swamps, and unexpectedly fierce resistance from lettow-vorbeck's Schutztruppe. Instead of a swift capture of an undefended town, the British and Indian troops found themselves pinned down, having suffered significant casualties, their morale already fraying under the strain of fighting an invisible enemy in terrifying terrain. Aitken, still directing the battle from the relative comfort of his transport ship offshore, remained stubbornly convinced that the German resistance was a mere bluff, a thin screen that would crumble before a determined push. He ordered a general assault on Tanga town for November 4th, seemingly oblivious to the tactical realities on the ground or the rapidly consolidating German defenses. Lettow-vorbeck, in stark contrast, had spent the night masterfully deploying his meager forces. Trainloads of Askari had continued to arrive, bringing his total strength up to perhaps 100 men, still massively outnumbered, but now holding prepared positions in and around the town. He positioned his precious machine guns, around a dozen Maxim guns, at key intersections and in the upper floors of sturdy stone buildings overlooking the likely British avenues of approach. His askari, already skilled marksmen and masters of concealment, were dispersed in small mobile groups, utilizing the dense vegetation of gardens, plantations, and the maze-like streets of the town itself. Lettow-Vorbeck's plan was audacious: allow the British to advance into the town, draw them into a confusing urban firefight where their superior numbers would be less effective, and then hit them with concentrated fire from concealed positions. He was turning Tanga itself into a trap. The British assault began mid-morning, preceded by a short and largely ineffective naval bombardment. HMS Goliath and Fox lobbed shells into the town, but without accurate spotting or clear targets, much of the fire fell harmlessly, or served only to further churn up the dusty streets. Then the infantry advanced. 2 brigades pushed forward. The 27th, Bangalore, brigade, composed mainly of Punjabi and Rajput regiments, advanced directly towards the town center from the south, while the Imperial Service Infantry Brigade, including the Kashmir Rifles, attempted a flanking maneuver to the west, aiming to cut the railway line. From the outset, the attack was plagued by poor coordination and leadership. Units struggled to maintain formation in the dense bush surrounding the town. Communication between battalions and between the infantry and their supporting artillery and naval guns was almost non-existent. As the leading battalions entered the outskirts of Tanga, they were met with a chilling silence. The streets seemed deserted. This unnerving calm was shattered suddenly as Lettow-Vorbeck's askari opened fire. From hidden positions in windows, behind garden walls, and in shallow trenches dug across streets, they unleashed devastating volleys of rifle and machine gun fire at point-blank range. The effect on the advancing Indian troops was catastrophic. Pinned down in the open streets, taking casualties from multiple directions, units began to waver. The noise of the battle became intense, the sharp crack of Mauser rifles, the relentless hammering of Maxim guns, the whistle of bullets ricocheting off stone buildings, and the screams of the wounded. The fighting quickly degenerated into a confused house-to-house struggle. British and Indian officers tried bravely to rally their men and lead charges against the German positions, but they were often cut down by unseen snipers. Lettow-Vorbeck himself was constantly on the move, cycling along his lines, directing fire, and encouraging his askari, his presence a stark contrast to Aitken's remote command. Then came the bees. In the heat and chaos of the battle, particularly during the advance through the plantations on the western flank, several units disturbed massive hives of wild African bees hanging in the trees. What followed was utter pandemonium. Swarms of angry bees descended upon the soldiers, British, Indian, and German alike, stinging indiscriminately. Men who had been bravely facing machine gun fire suddenly broke ranks and fled in terror, tearing at their clothes, their faces swelling grotesquely from hundreds of stings. Entire battalions dissolved into chaos as soldiers abandoned their weapons and ran blindly, pursued by the buzzing swarms. The bees inflicted more disruption and panic on some units than the German bullets had. While both sides suffered, the attack was particularly devastating for the already disorganized British advance. Machine gun crews abandoned their guns, officers lost control of their men, and the carefully planned flanking maneuver collapsed into a terrified rout. Lettow-Vorbeck's forces, already well concealed and disciplined, were better able to weather the stinging storm and exploit the ensuing chaos. The Battle of the Bees, as it became known, added a layer of surreal, almost comical horror to the already disastrous situation. As the afternoon wore on, the British assault completely lost momentum. The units that had penetrated the town found themselves isolated in pockets, surrounded by askari who seemed to be everywhere at once. Ammunition began to run low. Water became scarce in the oppressive tropical heat. Wounded men lay untreated in the streets, their cries adding to the general sense of despair. The loyal North Lancashire Regiment, the only regular British battalion present, fought with distinction, making some progress into the town centre, but they too became bogged down, taking heavy casualties. The fundamental problem remained. The British commanders simply could not coordinate their forces or bring their superior numbers and firepower to bear effectively in the confusing urban environment. Their attacks were piecemeal, unsupported, and easily broken up by lettow-vorbeck's flexible, guerrilla-style defense. One particularly disastrous incident highlighted the complete breakdown of British command. A battalion of the Kashmir Rifles, part of the Imperial Service Brigade, managed to advance deep into the western part of Tanga, reaching the railway station and even capturing the German field hospital located in the Hotel Deutscher Kaiser. This was a significant breakthrough. However, due to the collapse of communications, their success went unreported to General Aitken. Believing the entire attack had failed, Aitken ordered a general withdrawal back to the beachhead. The Kashmir Rifles, isolated and unaware of the order, suddenly found themselves surrounded as German forces closed in behind them. They were forced to fight their way back out, abandoning the ground they had won at great cost. This incident was emblematic of the entire battle. Individual acts of bravery and local successes nullified by overarching incompetence and a complete lack of situational awareness at the command level. By late afternoon, it was clear that the assault had failed catastrophically. The British and Indian troops, demoralized, exhausted, and decimated by casualties, began a disorganized retreat back towards the dubious safety of the Ras Kazone beachhead. The withdrawal was almost as chaotic as the advance. Units became separated in the darkness, and panic spread as rumors circulated of German counterattacks. Lettow-vorbeck, wisely husbanding his small force, did not launch a major pursuit, but allowed his askari to harass the retreating columns, adding to the confusion and inflicting further casualties. When the remnants of Force B finally stumbled back onto the beach, the scene was one of utter dejection. Hundreds of wounded lay groaning on the sand. Equipment lay abandoned everywhere. The carefully planned invasion had degenerated into a humiliating rout, inflicted by an enemy they had dismissed as racially inferior and militarily insignificant. General Aitken, finally forced to confront the reality of the disaster, made the decision to abandon the operation entirely. On the morning of November 5th, under a tense local truce arranged to allow both sides to collect their wounded, the re-embarkation began. It was conducted in an atmosphere of shame and disbelief. Thousands of British and Indian troops waded back through the mud to the waiting boats, leaving behind huge quantities of supplies, weapons, and ammunition on the beach, a parting gift to lettow-vorbeck's victorious Schutztruppe. They also left behind their dead. The British had suffered over 800 casualties, including over 360 killed. The German losses were significantly lighter, around 67 killed, including 16 German officers and NCOs, and perhaps 80 wounded. Lettow-vorbeck's tiny force had inflicted a stunning defeat on an enemy 8 times its size, capturing enough modern rifles, machine guns, and over 600,000 rounds of ammunition to equip his army for the next year of campaigning. The Battle of Tanga was over. It was one of the most comprehensive and humiliating defeats suffered by the British Empire in the entire First World War, a perfect storm of arrogance, incompetence, and unexpectedly fierce resistance, made all the more bizarre by the intervention of nature itself in the form of thousands of angry bees. The withdrawal of Indian Expeditionary Force B from the beaches of Ras Kazone on November 5, 1914, was an operation conducted in an atmosphere of profound humiliation. Under the watchful eyes of lettow-vorbeck's victorious askari pickets, thousands of British and Indian soldiers were ferried back to the waiting transports, leaving behind not only their dead, but also a staggering amount of military materiel. Rifles, machine guns, cases upon cases of ammunition, medical supplies, rations, engineering equipment, all lay abandoned on the sand. For lettow-vorbeck, this unexpected bounty was a gift from the gods of war. His tiny Schutztruppe, perpetually short of modern equipment, had just received enough supplies to sustain its guerrilla campaign for months, perhaps years. He had not only defeated the enemy, but had compelled them to rearm his own forces. The irony was bitter for the British and delicious for the Germans. The sight of Askari proudly shouldering brand-new British Lee-Enfield rifles became a symbol of the Tanga fiasco. News of the defeat sent shockwaves through the British military establishment and the wider empire. It was the first major land defeat suffered by Britain in the war, and it came at the hands of a vastly outnumbered colonial force that had been dismissed as insignificant. The initial reports were suppressed, shrouded in euphemisms, but the scale of the disaster could not be hidden for long. An official inquiry was launched, and the blame fell squarely and rightly on the commander, Major General Aitken. His litany of failures was almost comprehensive. He had relied on faulty intelligence, ignored local advice, failed to conduct proper reconnaissance, launched his attack with inadequate preparation, communicated poorly with his subordinates, and remained offshore, detached from the reality of the battle. He had displayed a lethal combination of arrogance and incompetence. Aitken was quickly relieved of command and sent back to England in disgrace, his military career effectively over. But Aitken's personal failings were only part of the story. Tanga exposed deeper, systemic problems within the British imperial military system, particularly concerning the Indian Army at the outbreak of the war. While some Indian regiments were superb, many units sent overseas in the initial rush were composed of reservists or recent recruits, lacking the training, cohesion, and experienced leadership necessary for modern warfare. Furthermore, the racist attitudes prevalent among many British officers meant they often underestimated the capabilities of their own Indian troops, leading to poor tactical decisions and a lack of trust. This was compounded by a near-universal underestimation of the fighting prowess of African soldiers serving in colonial armies. The Askari of the Schutztruppe were seen as little more than glorified policemen, incapable of standing up to European or Indian regulars. Lettow-Vorbeck knew better. He had trained his Askari rigorously, instilled in them a fierce esprit de corps, and treated them with a level of professional respect that was rare in colonial Africa. At Tanga, the Askari proved him right, fighting with discipline, skill, and a tenacity that shattered British preconceptions. Lettow-Vorbeck's own leadership was, of course, a critical factor. He displayed a tactical brilliance that was perfectly suited to the conditions. Outnumbered and outgunned, he refused to engage in a static defense or a decisive battle he knew he would lose. Instead, he used mobility, concealment, and surprise to maximum effect. He understood the terrain and how to use it as a weapon. He understood the psychology of his enemy, exploiting their arrogance and their fear of the unknown. His decision to rush reinforcements to Tanga by train was a calculated risk that paid off handsomely. His deployment of troops in concealed, mutually supporting positions turned the town into a death trap. His constant movement along the lines, directing fire and encouraging his men, maintained cohesion and morale in a way Aitken, isolated on his ship, could never achieve. Tanga cemented Lettow-Vorbeck's reputation as a master of guerrilla warfare, a reputation that would only grow as the East African campaign dragged on for 4 more years. The infamous bees also played their part, though their exact impact is often debated. While undoubtedly a terrifying and disruptive event, particularly for the flanking column, they were not the decisive factor. The British assault was already bogged down and failing due to German resistance and British incompetence before the bees attacked. The swarms merely added a layer of bizarre, humiliating chaos to an already unfolding disaster. They became a convenient, if slightly embarrassing, scapegoat in some initial British reports, but the true causes of the defeat lay in poor planning, leadership, and a fundamental underestimation of the enemy. The bees were merely nature's contribution to a perfect storm of failure. The strategic consequences of the Battle of Tanga were profound. The swift, easy victory the British had anticipated dissolved into a bloody and humiliating repulse. Instead of neutralizing German East Africa in a matter of weeks, the British were now faced with the prospect of a long, arduous, and incredibly costly campaign. Lettow-vorbeck, emboldened by his success and re-equipped with captured British arms, launched his guerrilla war in earnest. For the next 4 years, he would lead his Schutztruppe on an extraordinary campaign across East Africa, tying down hundreds of thousands of Allied troops, British, South African, Indian, Belgian, and Portuguese, consuming vast amounts of resources and remaining undefeated in the field until the end of the war. The failure at Tanga had allowed a minor colonial sideshow to metastasize into a major drain on the Allied war effort. The ripples of Aitken's incompetence spread far beyond the beaches of Ras Kazone. The battle also had a significant psychological impact. For the British Empire, Tanga was a sharp blow to its prestige and its sense of effortless martial superiority. It forced a painful reassessment of the capabilities of colonial troops, both their own and the enemy's. For Germany, Tanga was a much-needed propaganda victory, a rare bright spot in the early months of the war, showcasing German resilience and the fighting spirit of their colonial soldiers. For the Askari themselves, it was a moment of immense pride. They had faced the soldiers of the mighty British Raj and had sent them fleeing back to their ships. This victory further solidified their loyalty to Lettow-vorbeck and their belief in their own fighting prowess, sustaining them through the incredibly harsh years of campaigning that followed. In the final analysis, the Battle of Tanga stands as a stark warning against imperial arrogance and military incompetence. It was a battle where almost everything that could go wrong for the attackers did go wrong. Poor intelligence led to a flawed plan. Poor leadership led to chaotic execution. Poor training led to a collapse of morale under fire. A fundamental underestimation of the enemy led to a fatal lack of caution. Lettow-vorbeck and his Schutztruppe, in contrast, demonstrated the power of adaptability, local knowledge, disciplined execution, and inspired leadership. They used their weaknesses, their small numbers, as a strength, adopting tactics that their larger, more ponderous enemy could not counter. Britain had waited for Germany's African colony to politely surrender. Instead, they were met with a skillfully orchestrated defense, unexpected ferocity, and the bizarre intervention of nature. The result was not a swift colonial conquest, but a bloody nose, a humiliating retreat, and the beginning of one of the most remarkable guerrilla campaigns in modern military history. The bees may have added to the sting, but the wound itself was entirely self-inflicted.